Well, good afternoon, everyone, from a very sunny London. It's great to see everybody joining us here today. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat. It would be really nice to know who everybody is and where you're joining us from. Before we get on with the main business of the afternoon, I need to do a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is going to be recorded and it'll be shared on social media, our email newsletter. Then it'll be archived on the ODI website and it'll be shared on our YouTube channel. So if anybody knows folks who wanted to come today and couldn't make it, then that'll be there to share after today. We might actually use quotes and extracts from the questions that people ask in future communications. And if you would like to ask a question, please add it in the chat section at any stage, and we'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible in the Q&A. Which is going to come up after the main business of the day. So I'm Emma Thwaites. I'm the Director of Global Policy and Corporate Affairs at the ODI. I've worked alongside Sir Nigel for the last 13 years, and it's been absolutely brilliant. What an excellent ride we've had here at the ODI. And on that, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt. Sir Nigel is Executive Chair of the Open Data Institute, which he co-founded with Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And he's one of the world's foremost computer scientists. He's also a leading researcher in artificial intelligence and was one of the originators of the interdisciplinary field of web science. Nigel is also Principal of Jesus College, Oxford, a Professor of Computer Science at the University of Oxford, and a Visiting Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Southampton. In 2009, going back a bit in history, the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, appointed him and Sir Tim Berners-Lee as information advisors to transform access to public sector information. This work led to the highly acclaimed data.gov.uk site that now provides a portal to tens of thousands of data sets. In 2010, Nigel joined the UK government's Public Sector Transparency Board, overseeing open data releases across the public sector. And Nigel is also a Fellow of the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering, and a Fellow and former President of the British Computer Society. So with great pleasure, I'd like to welcome Sir Nigel and hand over to you on the topic of how to build a national data infrastructure.
Thanks very much, Emma, and it's really great to be with everybody today. A kind of a slightly tongue-in-cheek title, because if only we had entirely built it. What I'll try and talk about today are some of the challenges, what it is, what the challenges are, why we should bother, and what the opportunities and benefits might be. So we're all kind of familiar with the idea of infrastructures in daily life. We often think of them as built infrastructures like the railway system or the electrical grid system, roads. You can think of the web as an infrastructure that interconnects between all of the various nodes on the web and the routers, the connectors. We often think of infrastructures typically in these physical terms. And it's easy to get your head around then what the requirement is. We want them to be reliable. We'd like them to be efficient and scalable. We'd like to be able to repeat elements of the infrastructure that kind of manages costs. So when you look at those built infrastructures, there's a very strong focus on standards, on building to certain reliability criteria, to be able to swap elements in and out as you might need. The interoperability turns out to be key, so that you can connect one part of, say, a grid to a national grid to another, and often can be repurposable. So the actual grids are used to power a whole range of services. Our railway networks carry freight and people. That there is a general kind of reuse of the systems themselves. But if we think about data as infrastructure, what are we appealing to? We're certainly appealing to these ideas of reliability, repeatability, efficiency, scalability. And a couple of examples you see on the slide there. One of them is from work we actually did back in the early days, where we were looking to release data as open data. The Ordnance Survey released substantial amounts of its data as open data. Indeed, it released it using standards to represent the data that were highly organized, they were open, they were considered. And this is actually a slice of data that has to do with the administrative geography of the of England, and is a really nice example of where, by thinking ahead about the standards, the formats for data, how they could be reused in different contexts. We've got another example actually from a Google search for data sets on the web, which is a drug, essentially a schema for pharmaceutical descriptions or drug descriptions. So these standards do exist already. They tend often to be somewhat sector specific. And what we're looking at is an idea for defining data as a reusable and interconnectable and repurposable asset. It's one that is open. It's one that we can enrich. In the case of data, unlike some of our other physical data, some of our physical infrastructures, we can have the data be self-describing. Information about what the data is about, so-called metadata, is another element in our desire to move to a data infrastructure. As computer scientists, we'll be thinking about properties that allow us to abstract from the details of one data format into another, or encapsulation, what this ability to wrap data into particular packets or objects for onward use and reuse. This is the idea we're getting at. And I would say that one of the interesting features of treating data as infrastructure, often in talking to people in the field, they'll say they recognize the fundamental importance of data. It's always being talked about as a great asset, something we need to actually cherish, maybe even in some cases license, open freely, or in other ways exploit. But actually, often data is the plumbing or the spectaculars on the top. And if you think about the modern infatuation with AI, none of the AI services will be possible without effective data. But the data is often the plumbing beneath the surface. It's not the spectaculars. And one of the challenges we have in thinking about data as infrastructure is how we maintain and sustain it. How do we actually ensure that this rather kind of not so appealing as perhaps the end surface, how the data is maintained and managed, made fit for purpose, might indeed need to be redesigned, or indeed new data procured that we had never actually thought about. So we take the notion of a data asset seriously. And as we come to the idea of a data as an infrastructure, as an asset, we also come along with an associated set of ideas, many of which the Open Data Institute has been working on, one of which is data institutions. If we're going to take this view of data as essential infrastructure, how will we steward it? Where will it be curated? How will it be managed? How will appropriate terms of use be worked out? And the notion of data trust has come to the fore as one method, one variety of data institutions. There are a number, data cooperatives. There's a lot of exploration at the moment on how we can build the kind of institutional infrastructure that will support our virtual digital infrastructure, that will keep the data flowing and in a good state. And we've got examples of data institutions. Work that we did at the ODI, workshops we've convened, point out already existing use cases from UK Biobank through to the work of open corporates, listing a whole variety of data that relates to legally constituted companies. Or the work that has been done on open banking, which is often used as a great example of how you can have quite sensitive data into operating, making available new opportunities for third-party intermediaries. So we have gotten some real insights about how data institutions might work to steward our data infrastructure. And we're also moving to a situation where we think that if data is this essential part of our daily lives, then how can we assure its quality? The notion of data assurance is starting to emerge as a new kind of significant professional activity. How do we understand the standards and codes of conduct that allow high quality data to flow, that pass some of those properties and attributes of the quality of the data, the fact it remains interoperable, that is adhering to certain sorts of standards? With all of this, if we're going to treat data as a part of our critical national infrastructure, we're going to need individuals to steward and maintain it. And when we've looked at this from historic learnings, for example, during the pandemic, we saw this very interesting example at a precise moment when data became critical for our response in the pandemic. We realized that even if we had agreed the format of data, there was a whole set of additional work that was required to make sure that it got from the place it was to the place it might be used, whether that was in epidemiological modeling, whether it's trying to work out the impact on the economy. And these various roles that are enumerated on this slide, not necessarily embodied in separate individuals. Sometimes an individual might embody a number of these roles. But the crucial thing is we discovered that often to make the data flow is not a purely technical operation. You require human intervention. You require social engagement. You require discussions around the economics of integration. So the brokers and managers, the people who could actually set these systems up so that we could get to a stage as we did in the pandemic, where mobile telephone data was one of the key assets for us to understand mobility, which is one of the key insights we understood about the nature of the so-called contact matrices, what parts of the population were traveling, who were they interacting with. All done in a way that was not disclosive of individuals, but allowed us to build up these really interesting insights. So that piece of data infrastructure, interestingly enough, stood up for the purposes of the pandemic, is quite a nice example of where perhaps in a world where we want to make the best use of our data insights, we look to smooth out the integration of data incorporation, not just from the public sector, but from the private sector too. Okay, there is always going to be a set of issues around the ethics of data. In science, we've already had a long-standing set of principles that we look to try and operate, the so-called FAIR principles, that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. All important elements of your data infrastructure. But again, we actually found that in practice, the actual friction between data sets was considerable. And one of the significant frictions, of course, is the interaction between public and private data assets, between public and private goods. What is the data policy that we need to surround the use of our data if it is treated as an essential part of our infrastructure? What relationships do we need to establish? How do we ensure that there is an economically viable, as well as a technically viable and a governance model that is viable, support for our data? And we're starting to see this made very manifest in the recent tensions that have emerged around how data might be used in AI, in particular in large language models. So here, you might say, well, how is data and infrastructure here? Well, it's certainly been harvested and integrated into the large models at training time. One of the significant questions that's being raised is, was all that data actually acquired according to legitimate licensing? Were various IP considerations taken into account? How could we know? Do we know what data even went into these models? Is there transparency on the data that was used? So you can begin to see, even where data is an essential asset, as it is in AI, there are quite important questions if we are to allow our infrastructure, in some sense, to not just be, well, we definitely want to know what is the quality of the data ingested. We'd like to know its provenance. We'd like to know whether it has been appropriately assured and assessed. And there's now considerable concern that these models in the future might ingest data which has been variously manipulated or may not actually be suitably configured to provide the kind of decisions you need in these systems. So if you treat data as infrastructure, there are a whole family of associated challenges that arise, very much the challenges that we consider in the ODI. And again, a good example to think about here is so-called happenstance data. It was called this in work that was done again through the pandemic, where you can use data that has been generated for one purpose and reapply it in another context. Now, ideally in data infrastructures, this repurposing, which we talked about in the original set of criteria, is something you can anticipate. Sometimes data actually has qualities we don't realize at the time. So that repurposing turns out to be important. And associated with that is the question that, are we certain in our various activities that we have all the data we need? It shouldn't be the case that we build an infrastructure entirely on the data that happens to be lying around. It almost certainly will be the case going forward that new classes and types of data will emerge, and indeed to answer certain sorts of important policy, economic, and social question, we need to actively think about how we collect new classes of data. So data infrastructures are not fixed ahead of time. They need to be agile. They need to be adaptive. So I'm going to just leave it there in terms of some issues that we've raised there, and I'd like to get into a more conversational style now. And I'm also aware that there are many questions we haven't addressed here about how do you finance this? What are the appropriate governance models? Quite apart from where do we find what principles of technical design do we appeal to? Okay, so I will stop there. Thanks.
Nigel, thank you so much. A bit of a whistle-stop tour there. And actually, that was a great segue to, I'm going to take the host's privilege here and start us off with a few questions. So obviously the ODI, in our response to the Industrial Strategy Green Paper consultation, has made a strong case for data to be treated as infrastructure in the way exactly that you described, Nigel. But, you know, we're all aware that the public finances are under strain. And there is a big agenda for the current government to deliver, looking at its 5 missions. That's just looking at the UK, of course. You know, we see that replicated internationally as well. So who pays for data infrastructure?
Well, I think you would want to think of this as it's a public good on the one hand, and it will become a private good in many other situations. The private sector will benefit as well. So I think one has to take a view that this is an investable asset. It will be a mixed model. The government should not imagine it can absolve itself from all responsibility on, and of course, in many cases, it doesn't. It's one of the major sources of data creation and generation to fulfill all sorts of regulatory and public service provision requirements. And it also collects data, of course, to understand a whole range of aspects about how the country is performing, from health to education to employment. Now, those sorts of data have historically been collected by organizations such as the Office for National Statistics, the Ministry of Data, being collected in various places. The National Health is a huge repository of a lot of our health data, our Department of Education for data relating to individuals. So the government's already investing huge amounts in the collection of data. The question we face is, what more needs to be done to make that data in some sense, perhaps interoperable, that data available for repurposing, that data accessible in open formats. That doesn't mean that you make it openly available, but if you're using an open standard, you have some chance of not having to build different and variegated APIs to get into data to do with education, for example, whether that's higher education or secondary education. So there seems to me, clear requirement for government to step up and put resources and serious resources behind building an infrastructure, data infrastructure that is fit for use. And in the proposals, for example, one set of proposals around what's called the National Data Library is, I think they're certainly recognizing that there will be an investment required to bring data to its full potential. One of the things we did talk about in our ODI work was, well, where do you start? How do you boil the ocean here? And there's quite a strong feeling that you want to, in some sense, start with strong user-driven use cases where there's already an existing demand function. The idea that build it and they will come. We are aware when we built our previous infrastructures, actually physical ones, that you're looking to serve a demand that you either anticipate or know is already there. And we can think of quite a few of these across public sector, national and local government, from planning, as I say, to education, welfare, and the health service. Now, of course, there are substantial issues then about how we build infrastructure that is secure, that is trusted, that is assured. Environmental data, another good example. We're looking at all sorts of challenges now with a changing climate, where we absolutely are aware of the need to share and understand how we're being impacted. And this isn't just an interest of government, it's an interest of the private sector that insures these risks. So it's also the case that we can reasonably expect that for some of the high quality data required and to be maintained, we'd be looking to the private sector to understand that for certain information, there would be an economic benefit for them to invest. And certainly they do. If you look at fintech, it's very clear. They spend a huge amount of time cleaning, repurposing, and of course, then often subsequently reselling their data. And it's something of a success story, the way that financial data is able to flow. What we do need to do is work out where there's a public and a private interest in that data. Would some of it also be helpfully open and released? Some of it is. So we're not looking at, in the same way, you don't expect your physical infrastructures just to apply in a public context. We might be working in a private space too. So a mixed model, I think I would say.
Excellent, thanks. I'm gonna ask one more, and then we've got a whole raft of questions coming from the audience. So I'm going to go over to those. But my other question is about AI. And again, the ODI's talked a lot about how you make national data infrastructure AI ready. And I just wonder, you've written a lot, you've researched a lot and written a lot on artificial intelligence. And I just wonder whether, these new technologies place additional pressures on the sort of complexity, if you like, of building national data infrastructure.
So the question is?
So I just wonder whether, there's a lot of promise and a lot of expectation around artificial intelligence and how it can have such transformative power across all sectors. I'm just wondering what we do with data to make it AI ready. Does it add complexity to building the national data infrastructure?
Well, it's very interesting to see what's happening in the world, for example, of generative AI in particular, which is a huge consumer of data. We know it is. We know there are actual worries that we could run out of data, for the very largest models. How do you train them going forward? Has this data been appropriately collected? Have license and copyright and IP issues been fully taken into account? So leaving that aside, the issue of ensuring that the data, you shouldn't leave them. So one question is to simply give up on the notion that we can absorb anything we need into these models seems to me problematic on a number of fronts. I know this is something the government is looking about and thinking about, not least in the area of creative industries. But I think that what we're seeing develop, interestingly, in a lot of the more recent AI work, and we saw it in systems like the DeepSeek's R1, is that this so-called distillation process. So very large models are being, in certain sense, made compacted down, sparsified or distilled, made smaller, and those models are then being used as a base from which against which additional data or knowledge is being used to refine and tune them. And what you find there is that that some of the most impressive results in terms of capability are when you take, in some sense, these small language models, which are being sort of applied to specific domains and tasks, and tune them with very bespoke, very high quality, sometimes private data. You don't have to then let your data into the public world where it will be ingested into the large models. And understanding what the resultant behaviors of those models are they trustworthy? Do we know that they are performing to the level, the benchmarking we'd expect? So there's a whole, making data AI ready is, in a certain sense, to take quite a broad approach to those quality issues we were talking about, our infrastructure, and applying them seriously, rather than simply this massive ingest with a significant case of indigestion. Literally, the largest models where in the early days, 50% of their ingest was social media. Huge amounts of effort was put into detoxifying these models, not least because the data was somewhat toxic.
Excellent. Thank you, Nigel. I'm going to go to the audience questions now. We've had a lot and we're going to jump about a little bit, so be ready. We've got the first question up in the Q&A channel was about the points that you made about data trusts as a sort of an essential piece of governance for data infrastructure. And the audience member asks, how do we establish trust in data trusts? And they actually point to, say, look at how the DFE treated the National Pupil Database over the years, as an example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essential. So the idea that we, in some sense, don't have a wider conversation about appropriate modes of use. So when we see, for example, and this applies not just in publicly held data like education data. One of my colleagues, Ben Goldacre, makes a big issue out of the large amount of drug trials data that should be in the public domain. In fact, there is expectations it should be that can tell you a huge amount, not just about those trials that work, but the ones that failed. So that sort of data out there in the open has all sorts of benefits. If you're going to use the National Pupil Database as an example, you have to have some very strong guarantees around both appropriate use, anonymization, proportionality. What are the results being used to do? What are the actual insights that are being derived? What's the purpose that is driving the goal, driving these appropriations? Of course, it is possible, and we've seen this in the use of linked medical patient data, that the data may contain patterns that physicians themselves wouldn't be aware of. And so you actually can make discoveries on this. But in many other cases, clinicians and researchers are going in with specific questions that they can now ask at scale across large cohorts where the data never leaves the trusted research environment. So this building trust in the trusted research environments or the institutional trusts is essential. And of course, it doesn't take many bad apples in that barrel to kind of get people to think, no, this is something so we have to think quite carefully about that communications, that set of data we will use, and show how it can be used for a real public purpose. So one thing we've looked at, we've considered, and in fact, I saw in the chat, someone was saying, what about housing data? One of the areas where this data can be really powerful is in all sorts of areas like fuel poverty, various issues around housing, insulation, thermal efficiency, and that we've actually been involved in helping start companies who look at data in these domains, but working really seriously on trying to uncover and then steward data in areas that have both a social and an economic value is a good place to start. And having something that's really driven by an absolute need, which we can agree is one that serves both, as I say, an economic as well as a social purpose, governance purpose, and an economic one, ideally.
Excellent. And what's the role of regulation and the law in that context?
Well, I think it's really quite important. We know that so regulators, in particular, regulation is an area. In fact, regulatory data is another kind of interesting example. There are quite a few examples where the release of certain types of data can itself point out to deficiencies or challenges in our regulatory sector. Complaints data, for example, in areas like Ofcom. So for a start, data as infrastructure can be helpful in how we think about regulation, but the regulators themselves and the legal powers we might want to take to ensure that data is used appropriately, is essential. And again, we have some examples. We can all think of examples where perhaps the law has been overreaching and had unintended consequences. But in other cases, we have sitting in statutes protections which people barely notice. For example, it's impermissible to de-identify health data even if you've gotten hold of it in certain circumstances. You can literally write that over the data. Now, to say that doesn't stop people technically being able to do it, but they are then accountable in law for that activity. So working out modes of use, how it's used, I think it's one of my slight concerns is that we simply imagine that in the rush to the perceived advantages of AI, we forget that we need to be thoughtful about appropriation, misappropriation, balance of interests. We saw this right in the early days of algorithmic decision making, all sorts of issues around fairness and equity, which then were traced back to the data itself. And ultimately, you get to a situation where you want to say you can't absolve yourself of the fact that the data was never fit for purpose. In some contexts, you're going to be held accountable for it, and so you should be.
And I've got a very specific question, which I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to come back to a question about happenstance data. So one of the audience asks, what's happening with data coming from camera surveillance? Are those data used to train AI?
Well, camera surveillance, you will know that certain sorts of use, in particular, camera surveillance. So in Germany, for example, when CCTV is being used for all sorts of interesting historical reasons, faces cannot be identified within that context. In fact, there's masking kind of technology in play there, and we know there's huge amounts of data being collected and produced by the almost inconceivable amount of imagery that's being taken on a daily basis. So, the CCTV is one thing. The incidental collection of data that we're all engaged in that is already something quite interesting. So, what data is being used to train what? It's clear that, as we know, many of the breakthroughs in AI machine learning were built off the back of very large stewarded collections, for examples of images, facial images, for example. Fei-Fei Li's work was actually to build a great standardized database that could be used to train AI algorithms on to do image recognition. So you can certainly see benefits, but of course you're speaking to the fact that where is the proportionality in this, who's given permission, and do we know? I think there are fairly clear stipulations if you can be bothered to find the terms and conditions of the kind of photo management tools that we use in our daily basis. But again, it seems to me that we ought to make it extremely clear and very straightforward to understand just how protected the data that we generate is. And very often, our use of social media platforms, for example, we don't always automatically exercise the discipline, or the effect of managing your data with agencies so high that actually it's just easier to let it go under terms that you might not wish. And that seems to me quite challenging. So that question, educating ourselves about what are the platforms doing variously with the data? How do their terms and practice vary? We actually did research in Oxford. One of my PhD students did some great work on looking at whether or not data collection and use practices changed pre-GDPR and post-GDPR. And I can tell you in a very significant number of cases, we could see no difference in practice.
That's so interesting. Interesting too, the point about terms and conditions and the responsibility of the individual citizen to make sure that we are content with the terms under which we share our data. Those terms and conditions are quite opaque in a lot of instances, not least of all because they're so long and indecipherable. Quite often. Let's move on or go back slightly to this question about happenstance data, because I do want to get that one in. So the questioner asks, how can we ensure that happenstance data is used ethically, given legal and ethical principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, specification, and so on?
Yeah, and I think that's again, if you look at the example we had in the pandemic, there was specific requirements around that. It took some quite serious wrangling to get that data used. I think there was a general sense of public consent that this was not unreasonable, not least because we had no idea. It turned out we didn't have the fundamental data assets we needed to answer questions that the epidemiologists needed. It's called the contact matrix, which is what's the likelihood of somebody in a particular area meeting any number of other people of a particular part of the demography. You know, what are those? What's the social contact graph look like? And of course, in some sense, mobile telephony data gave you some clues, at least coarse-grained clues around what that looked like qualitatively. Were in fact the non-pharmacological interventions, various forms of lockdown, having the right kind of, were they being adhered to? Where were there large flows of potential infection that could occur through particular routes? Of course, a large number of workers through the pandemic were busy working. They had jobs that had to be done. So there was all sorts of insights that were derived from that. But that was, I think, in that case, there was a well understood purpose. There was a proportionality, and this did not endure beyond the actual authorities that were given during that pandemic. So the question about what we need to constantly do to oversee appropriate and proportionate use of data is an absolutely key one. Of course, it's one that has now extended. I mean, the ICO, for example, its own activity is hugely related to kind of understanding whether there is or is not appropriate usage here. But the question of whether we need new classes of oversight and a different kind of assurance, which is to understand that if we put purpose limitations around these things, they are appropriately being observed, that we've got a relatively efficient and well-constituted means of governance to put these things in place. That, again, the slight worry I have is that if we're not careful, we throw huge amounts of data over the fence, and then it gets enclosed in a way that we can't actually necessarily control. So I can see the problem from the other side too, but I think it's a great question, and it's one that we need to invest in. It's not something just solves itself. And it's a place where often, interestingly enough, civic society plays an important role. If you think of the work of people like Med Confidential, who are thinking about how data is being used, medical and health data, in this new world, and are patients' rights and interests being respected, and are the proposed benefits and the tooling that's being used sufficient to guarantee an appropriate level of assurance.
Excellent. I'm going to switch contexts again. So we've had a question about synthetic data, which is super interesting. The questioner says, given there is a growing trend to use very large LLMs to generate synthetic data for creating new solutions, do we need a new category of data creators who are licensed, assured, and audited?
That's a really interesting thought. Well, I mean, it's quite right that we are generating huge amounts of synthetic data. There's an entire field emerging that's concerned with the different methods of doing it, the various frameworks you can use to both generate it and analyze its properties. Because it might seem, that just simply replicating the statistical distribution, but in a non-real set of examples, ought to be something that you could reliably do. There are all sorts of kind of issues that do come out, and so the notion of the data practitioners who thought long and hard about how that data is generated, rather than just relying on the market to find the best solution, is a really interesting one. I think there are probably areas where the use cases are really quite critical, and you would certainly want some assurances that there wasn't something pathological in the synthetic data. We do know, of course, that synthetic data itself, and it's something I talked about in an earlier ODI presentation, can introduce artifacts into the subsequent training. So large language models that are trained on the output of themselves or other large language models can start to amplify artifacts that appear slight at first. But if that keeps happening, you get essentially artifacts that don't have corollaries in the real world. So, or skew the distribution in various ways, often a regression to the mean that can be seen in some applications. So, yeah, I think that is a really interesting idea. You would like to feel, as we enter this new world, new skills are demanded, new forms of accreditation are seen to be important, and that a new form of professional class, in a way, professional qualification, sets of insights that, of course, will be, again, a blend of human and machine-assisted analysis.
Excellent. A slight provocation now. So somebody has said, which I guess is a statement for you to respond to rather than a question. Sir Nigel, I would respectfully say that the use and processing of data, in brackets, the regulation of data, is becoming unregulated activity through the updates to data privacy regulation. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there is, in general, a concern that if we adopt something of a counsel of despair, or imagine, I mean, privacy is a particularly interesting example because under our own characterization of privacy under the common law, privacy, we have a reasonable expectation of privacy. If we collectively kind of change our sense of what that is, we kind of, there's a slight fear that with everything that's happening, it's a race to the bottom. So I think there are lots of examples, and just because there is a huge investment and large, massive generation of data, which is not, I mean, back to the issue of the data infrastructure, which is that this is partly an argument for a part of your data ecosystem which is much more curated, managed, you might say reliable and assured than other parts of that space. And what does that mean that other parts are safe? Is it unsafe? Is it in some sense incapable of being effectively overseen? I think we are bound to see examples where egregious decisions that arise or analyses that arise from our AI systems, which in many cases cannot be perfect. I mean, there, of course, are AI methods which can give you validated and verified results, and we design, things like our iPhones off the back of those very strong proofs about the validity of the digital systems we build. Guarantees around the extent to which the data can be compromised or decoded or not, kept encrypted. And I think we understand that when we don't apply standards to a high level, bad actors can intervene, bad decisions can get made, outcomes result, which we recognize as being harms. And there are moments when that becomes a very serious problem indeed, and will drive people back to consider, shouldn't we be working harder on keeping at least part of our ecosystem highly regulated and highly operating to a high degree of performance?
Excellent, thank you. Another question's come in about the slightly controversial or uncertain area of the valuation of data, how you place a monetary value on data. And the questioner has asked, if data is to be investable, how do you see the development of a financial services product or regime developing where there's a strong possibility of conflict with the ethical data standards and interests of data subjects? That's picking up on that kind of contradiction or perceived contradiction.
So replay that one again.
Okay. If data is to be investable, how do you see the development of a financial services product or regime developing, whether there's a strong possibility of conflict with the ethical data standards and interests of data subjects?
Well, there could be. I mean, you can imagine that. I mean, one interesting feature of that question is the whole extent to which data and data assets come to have an actual allocated value on the asset register. How do you estimate that? What are the economics of establishing that? In a sense, we know they must have, because we can see plenty of businesses that trade data, from the Bloombergs of this world on. So we know that data brokeraging, data sets themselves can come to have significant intrinsic value and indeed generate lots of subsequent follow-on revenue. The question about how the ethical, what's the origin, what's the provenance, how has that value been realized? I mean, it is one of the concerns, I think, that often arises when you start thinking about whether public sector data collected for a public service, such as the National Health, or indeed what was originally a public service, the Royal Mail, the postcode address file, which were the legal addresses of all the legal addresses in the UK, was floated off when the Royal Mail was privatised. And I would submit has not been stewarded to the best level it could have been. But what actually happened was a public asset, which had been the result of a huge amount of decades-long investment by a public service, was essentially privatized. And people felt in that case there were real ethical questions to be asked around whether that sort of asset replacement was what you really wanted to do. In other cases, we know that the data was openly made available, and the networks effect that afloat from some of this core foundational data. And I think, again, if we go back to the early days of open data, which still seems to me work in progress, there's still plenty of data which one could argue is non-personal, is important to the national purpose, and has more value being made openly available than simply having a rent sweated for it locally, or indeed not published at all. Then we've got examples where we really saw network effects when that data was made available. And we often use the example of transport data, particularly in the London context. It's undeniable that the ecosystem that evolved as a result of that meant that the experience, the lived experience of people in this city and the service that could be built of it generated substantial value for everyone.
Mm. Excellent. I think we're about 7 minutes off the top of the hour, so I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions. I know they're still flooding in, so I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. The next one, I'm really pleased this has been asked because this relates to international interoperability. So the question is, should public data assets and infrastructure be limited by national borders, boundaries, or should this be a global/international effort?
I mean, ideally, yes. In some key areas, that is kind of happening. I mean, again, if you take certain areas of science, the interesting thing about that is different funding agencies, but often public funded agencies, have invested in work in climate, in environmental monitoring, for example, and a huge amount of effort went into beginning to standardize those collection efforts to allow for interoperability between data. It happens in other areas which may seem more remote, literally in some sense. Astrophysics is another area, in astronomy, areas of genomics and biology, where the public enterprise that is open science has been very international in one sense. And geospatial is another example where efforts for standardization have also happened. People have talked about the same thing. Open banking, you could argue, is an international effort in different financial jurisdictions. You can imagine that there is a high degree of desirability for agreeing formats for everything from, extractive industry reporting through to emissions reporting. Now, in an age where there is some tension on our multilateral institutions, I'd like to think that I'd like to imagine we can stay where we are. I would hate for us to start going backwards, but ideally, yeah, I think there's certainly places where we could look to our data flows don't stop it, but sometimes they do stop at borders for appropriate reasons, and we understand that. But that's a choice we can make. It's a little bit like the famous example with the built infrastructure with the railway gauges, which changed as you went from one geography into another, and they were done deliberately so that the invading armies couldn't suddenly find themselves accessing an infrastructure that got their supplies in country. So they actually made the whole business much more difficult by having non-interoperable standards. So there are areas where you say, look, there's a legitimate interest but in the digital world, the great thing is that, in some sense, if you agree the standards, the issue about whether those standards are then used and data flows permitted is a second one. It's the opportunity to engineer to a common set, a common ontology, or a common set of reference items. Of course, there'll be local variations in lots of situations. So I think the international effort is important. And it will, it's the network effect again. If I do find and we see this again in medicine with various vocabularies that are emerging that standardize aspects of reporting medicine, the drugs ontology I showed earlier on. There are opportunities to do this. We see it in cultural heritage. There are standardized ways of referencing materials. So, yes, is the answer to that.
Excellent.
It'd be great to get our own national house in order.
Yes, and actually, this one is quite related. This is the final question, so we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left of our time. And I'm sorry to those who posted questions that we're not going to have time to get to. But this questioner asks, how can or should the difference between national regulations be considered? So this again relates to the international piece. If a company outside of our regulatory framework takes data that might sit within our regulatory framework and then provide back a tool users in our regulation framework, a tool to users in our regulation framework, how should these international organisations be policed? How would the knock to productivity be balanced by potential abuses of regional regulations? So an international, I guess, company outside of our regulatory framework takes data or uses data that might sit within our regulation framework, but then they provide a tool back to users within our regulation framework.
Well, I mean, there is already, there have been quite some time concerns around various relations that allow data to flow, adequacy discussions between data, even moving in or out of the EU, for example. There were safe haven, safe harbor arguments around data moving off out of the EU into the US, for example, 10 years ago, let alone how we might be thinking about that now. Again, one of the things that is important about even beginning to address that is, what are the provenance technologies that we use to identify the origin and source of data in the first place, and warrant that it has not, in some sense, been repurposed in some form or fashion. The move has definitely occurred. It's back to the question of metadata, self-describing data, where the data about the data is much larger than the underlying core data itself, and it has to be, because it's serving a lot of purposes. From giving you some warrant about where it came from, when it was collected, under what conditions. Data terms of use come into this as well, and that's going to be one of the key things in building these data infrastructures. Without that, we might well be susceptible or seeing data that's re-exported from one context into another, and in some sense the regulatory regimes have changed. We see this in other fields, of course. It's not unique to digital. I mean, we worry about chlorinated chicken, do we not? And it's the idea that stuff that originates under one jurisdiction does not have the attributes we like. And where there is this constant recycling of data, again, I think it's important we don't simply give up in the face of comments that, well, this large language model has ingested all the data that's out there and end of story. There's quite a lot more story to be told on that, and there are very different approaches to that question itself.
What an excellent line to end on, Nigel. So Nigel Shadbolt, thank you so much for really brilliant. We went so wide in that conversation.
Some great questions. I've seen some great questions in the channel we didn't get to.
Yeah, I know.
Colleagues, you'll just have to buttonhole me in another context.
We will be sure to do that. So I'd like to say thanks ever so much to our brilliant audience of participants for being here, for all your questions. I'd like to say thank you. Can't see Joe. Joe is next to me in the room. David is in the room with Nigel. Kwaku, our IT support. Thank you for all your assistance today, but most particularly to Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt, the Executive Chair of the ODI. Thank you for your time.
Your pleasure. Thanks very much, Emma. Thank you.